It's nearly 3 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. Since then, the West has tried to isolate Vladimir Putin's regime. Sanctions have been applied and diplomatic contact limited. But all of that begins to change today when Putin's foreign minister, Sergey Lavrov, meets with Donald Trump's Secretary of State in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. What should we expect? Karin Von Hippel is the former senior advisor in the US State Department, who also previously worked as a political advisor to the UN and the EU. Good morning.
Good morning.
What is your expectation from these talks today? Is this a very early stage, or are we likely to see some result at the end of the day?
It's definitely early stage, and I think we need to be a little bit careful not to get overly excited about Ukraine not being in the room or being in the room, or where are the Europeans? I think it's just too early. The Russians are really complicated. I'm going to give Marco Rubio credit for understanding that they're very manipulative and not be taken for a ride by the Russians. So you can look at it in a very positive way or a very negative way, and I'm going to try to look at it in a positive way until I'm told not to.
I'm really interested that you say that, because I think a lot of people interpret the way that these talks have been set up as a slight against Ukraine, or a sense from Donald Trump's side, at least, that Russia is the most important partner. And indeed, some of his comments overnight, when asked if Ukraine should have an equal weight in these talks, he said that's an interesting question. So you think maybe Europe is reading too much into this?
Europe is right to be nervous, and the UK is right to be nervous about not understanding what they're doing. I'm not sure they know what they're doing. I think we've seen this over and over again from Donald Trump, that he shoots from the hip and then he changes his mind. And it makes it very difficult for the people who are his ministers to do their job, because they don't always know if he will agree with what they're doing. It's not like they walk into a meeting with a set of agreed talking points and a strategy that most governments, that's the way most governments work. They'll decide on a strategy and then they'll decide tactically how to implement it. There is no real strategy here. And so we've already seen Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense in Munich, said one thing, and then the next day he had to walk it back. So it's quite difficult. I think Rubio, though, is the most sophisticated of all of the people that are representing Trump, and he certainly will listen to wise voices like Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. He's the Republican senator who has Donald Trump's ear, who is very nervous about Russia, and he's come up with some very creative ideas, including having some sort of trigger that if Russia invades later, Ukraine automatically joins NATO. And he's also been talking to Trump about the rare earths in Ukraine and how to think about that along with the Ukrainians. So it is more complicated than we're hearing, but it doesn't mean that things won't go terribly wrong. I'm not going to promise any of that.
So do you think that Marco Rubio is going into those meetings today, even if it's just an early stage and maybe this stuff isn't going to be discussed today or maybe even tomorrow, but with a sense that America needs, okay, as a red line, we need access to X amount of rare minerals which are in Ukraine. We need X amount of billions of dollars repaid through this and this scheme. We're going to ensure that Ukraine can't join NATO. Do you think it's going to be as clearly delineated as that?
No, not yet, because don't forget, a lot of the rare earths that Donald Trump seems to want are in the Russian occupied areas. So in a sense, the Ukrainians don't mind that. They're not going to give it away for free. They'll do some deal where they sell it, but they're in Russian occupied areas. So it's, how do we prevent Russia from getting that? The other thing not to forget is that Donald Trump doesn't want to look like a sap. So if he says, okay, we've declared a ceasefire, the war is over, and walks away with no American support for some sort of peace operation afterwards, and it all crumbles, he doesn't look good. And he's very nervous about that, too. So, I think that at the moment, I think that they'll probably be probing the Russians to see what's in the art of the possible. So far, the Russians haven't indicated they're willing to bend on anything. And they see Ukraine as being basically part of Russia. They want to subsume the entire country. So, in a sense, if anybody can make progress with Putin, it is probably Donald Trump. The question is, what kind of progress, and will Putin be taking Donald Trump for a ride or not?
Yeah. Sergey Lavrov is the first stage in these talks. He's been around for a long time. He's been foreign minister for 21 years. He's met with many ministers in former UK governments. Have you come across him much? What's he like as an
I
operator?
have. In fact, it's funny that you mentioned Kosovo at the start because a gazillion years ago in 2000, I was working in Kosovo in the UN mission, and I think he was actually the UN ambassador at the time, and they came over all the time and they screamed and shouted at us at the UN because they felt that we were giving, the Albanians were being given too much against the Serbs, their fellow Orthodox Christian. They were trying to protect them, and so I saw firsthand how aggressive he can be, and let's just say he doesn't bend at all. Now at this stage, he's older. He is doing what Putin wants him to do, and he is really a bit like a Rottweiler. So he is a tough, wily, very smart man, even if he's not as young, perhaps, as he used to be.
And what do you think he will be like across the table from Rubio? Are they well matched?
I don't know. I mean, Rubio is not naive. He's not super experienced as a diplomat. He's an experienced politician, but not as a diplomat. But he isn't naive. He will have taken counsel by a number of people who know Russia very well and know Lavrov very well. So he's not going to just say, believe the lies that the Russians tell all the time. He's not naive that way. So I'm hoping for the best, but let's all expect the worst. And I think that's what the Brits and the Europeans are doing right now by, thinking through scenarios, which is the right thing to do. It's a right thing to be thinking about a peace force, what it would entail, how it would be organized, how much it would cost, how do you pay for it? All those issues need to be on the table right away. And also, by the way, how to bolster European defense over the long term.
Well, I wanted to ask you that finally. I mean, you've worked as a political advisor to the UN and to the EU. Do these institutions matter anymore? I mean, the UN particularly and NATO, do they have a place in the world anymore? Given that Trump is shaking up the world order, that Europe is having to think about itself in a completely different way, do they make sense anymore?
Yeah, great question. I think with NATO, the answer is yes. And with the UN, I'm not sure. I used to, as you mentioned, work for the UN. I was a believer, and I find it increasingly unable to get anything done, especially at the level of the Security Council when you have Russia and China able to block pretty much anything, including even humanitarian resolutions. So I think the UN is no longer fit for purpose. It was designed for a different period. It was designed for a post-World War II era that's now long gone, especially with the advent of the second Trump administration. NATO has done a good job, has done a great job coordinating aid to Ukraine, has done a great job in a number of other conflicts. So I don't think it's the end of NATO, but the question will be, what is the American commitment to NATO under Donald Trump? I mean, don't forget, NATO expanded after this war started in Ukraine, with Sweden and Finland joining in the last year or so. I'm not as pessimistic about NATO as I am about the UN, unfortunately.
Karin Von Hippel, former senior advisor in the US State Department, and of course has a wealth of political experience in the UN, the EU, and with Sergey Lavrov. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
I can't work out what she says, expect the worst and hope for the best. It's just hard to see from all we've learned about everything what the best can look like, because there's no way Putin is going to give up rare mineral rights to America in the Russian-held areas, is it?
Well, it depends what the price is.
Yeah. And it just strikes me that Trump regards Ukraine as the defeated party. And he talks up Putin, the Russians won against Hitler, they won against Napoleon. Implication, they've won against Ukraine, which isn't true. And they haven't dominated Ukraine. They've had a very long attritional war that's been a stalemate for a year. So they haven't won that. But they're being regarded as the victors, and to the victor the spoils. And what does that mean for Ukraine? And what does that mean for us supporting Ukraine? And Trump, you look at his track record, Kate. He said he was going to bring about peace between North Korea and South Korea. But he spent a lot of time talking about that. He met Kim Jong-un. And when it went wrong, he just said, well, it didn't. He just asserts it didn't happen. So what confidence can we really have, I guess is the question. What confidence can people genuinely feel that this is going to be productive?